Alright, I'm gonna be reading chapter 15 from The Devil in Massachusetts. Chapter 15, the title is The Devil in Andover. The executions of 19 July had a profound effect upon the other witches awaiting their turn in trial. The earlier hanging of Bridget Bishop had made less impact because, guilty or not, she was too isolated an individual a case to set up precedent. But of these others, three were respectable women. Their neighbors had attested to their decency, and yet they had been hung just as dead as the indelible witch Sarah Good. Most frightening was the fate of Rebecca Nurse. Thanks to the divination of her family and her own intelligence and courage, her case had been defended with a skill that even more highly connected witches could not hope to surpass. But it had all been in vain. Whatever was accomplished with the jury was immediately undone by the implacability of the judges, even when she was reprieved. The reprieve was revoked. What hope was there for any of them if all this that had been achieved for one had been brought to nothing? But the steely purpose of William Stoughton had a clamorous and the clamors of the afflicted. It was no accident that it was the day after the hanging, that the day of fasting and prayer was held in the home of the now thoroughly unhappy John Alden. Not only were prayers offered by Willard and Cotton Mather, but one of the judges participated, Samuel Sewall. His contribution was the reading of the sermon. Dr. Preston, first and second, uses of God's all-sufficiency, and the recording of the event in his diary. During the prayer, the drought broke, at least momentarily, in the brave shower of rain. But whether this was a sign of God's providence in regard to the witchcraft, none venture to prophecy. Some of the witches, especially those who had means, now begun to lay plans which had no reference to the court of Oyer and Terminer. Nathaniel Carey's matured first. Although this man, who had his own accord brought his wife to court, abandoned the legal process with reluctance after he had followed the Salem trials and had found them a cruel mockery. He at first tried to have his wife brought to trial not in Salem but in Suffolk County. Only when that plan failed did he sound out the chances of breaking jail. On 30 July, he succeeded in smuggling her out of prison and getting her to Rhode Island. Proving a precarious sanctuary with pulsars hot on the trail to New York. Edward Bishop and his wife, aware that little mercy was likely to be shown any connection to the notorious Bridget, made a break somewhat later and managed to lie low until the storm had passed. Philip and Mary English waited in Boston almost until the eve of their trial, and if tradition can be believed, then had to be coaxed into flight. Being people of influence, friends of Sir William and Lady Mary Phipps, they were privileged characters, and even under restraint had some excellent some yeah, and had to some extent the library of the town during the day. At least they were allowed to go to meeting and hear the Reverend Joshua Moody preach. Moody had interested himself in witchcraft when Cotton Mather was still a stammering stripling. Long experience had given him an outlook somewhat like that of Samuel Willard. At the very least, whenever his opinions on the common sort of witches like Sarah Good and Susanna Martin, he had no practice with people who preferred such changes against the people like Philip English. But he was also aware that the judges were likely to encourage the acquittal of one who was not merely a suspected wizard, but an outspoken critic of the children of the covenant. Wow, that just sounds like a cult. His very eminence made it the more imperative to prosecute him, for some people were murmuring that their failure to prosecute other eminent suspects, for instance, ex-judge Stall, with all in his mind, Moody selected his text with care on Sunday. When he saw the Englishes taking their places before him, if they prosecute you in one city, flee to another. This he followed with a sermon which in Salem would have sounded like treason. The proposition being the wisdom of flying from injustice. After the sermon, Moody and his associate Willard visited the Englishes in prison and explicitly urged flight. English demurred. He preferred to face the judges, not out of heroism. He had spent much of the spring dodging arrests, but because he knew that flight would be the legal equivalent of conviction, and that his property would be forfeit. Well, it's going to be forfeit anyway if you're dead. And Philip English had great possessions. God will not permit them to touch me, accordingly, said Philip. But his wife had endured several more weeks of prison than he, and had so many more weeks' experience of the magistrate's mind and of the character of those whom the magistrates had been hanging. Do you think the sufferer is innocent? She asked. Why may not we suffer also? Philip, still hesitant, the ministers told him that if he could not carry his wife away, they would. She was ill, having fallen into the consumption during her months in prison. So Englishes fled, and it was a flight deluxe again, a tradition that can be believed. For all the story about them, except the mere fact of flight, was recorded a generation or so after the event. The merchants in New York were supposed to have sent a carriage for them. Sir William is supposed to have soothed their way. He would have thus far lacked the courage to interfere decisively and openly with his subordinate Stoughton's persecution. Was willing in private to lend a helping hand to his friends. He arranged for them to leave prison at midnight and give them letters of an introduction to his colleague, Governor Benjamin Fletcher of New York. The latter was already showing Miss Carey every courtesy and stood ready to protect many more. New York, a colony where, thanks to the influence of the rational Dutch, witchcraft was not taken very seriously and was in the way of acquiring a distinguished little colony of refugees. John Alden held out until September. It was of a midnight that friends in Duxbury were wakened by the pounding on the door and a bursting in of a tall man from Boston. "The devil is after me!" cried John Alden, and his friends saw to it that the devil did not lay hands on him again. All these escaped, and in time many more, nor so far as plain people could discover, the judges make any serious attempt to pursue the fugitives if they were of better class, and got as far as New York. After a while, this observation created a scandal. There was no democracy among witches after all. If you were poor and could run no further than Lancaster, the law would overtake and hang you. If you were rich and well connected and were thus able to flee New England altogether, the judges would ignore the fact that the extradition and capital causes a possible between colonies. It was in this season that that is sometime between June trials and the hanging of 19 July that the devil took over Andover. He had got in by a self-shamed doors through which he had entered Salem village, medicine and ministry, but the latter he did not get so warm and welcomed as he had from the ministers of Salem village and town. There were two ministers in Andover, and it was apparently the younger Thomas Bernard who opened the door. The elder Francis Dane applied all his might to closing it, at least when he saw who was coming through. Dane was indeed to fight the plague with a heroism unequaled by all who had choice in the matter, risking not only his own life and reputation, but what have come harder, the lives of nearly all the women folk in his family. And in this fight he was at first alone, deserted by his own deacons, who regarded him at best as an old and failing man, too far behind the times to appreciate the modest and modern science. It began with the illness of the wife of Joseph Ballard. It had been going on for a long time, and there was little satisfaction to be got from the doctor who attended her. At the time, the Queen of Hell, Martha Carrier, was uncovered in Andover. Ballard was making up his mind where the real difficulty lay, and looking about him. Whoops, I just lost my place. And looking about him for a more expert diagnostician to confirm his belief. Such a one could not be found in Andover. It was not that the town lacked for people who dreamed dreams and saw visions, but local mediumistic talent had never impressed anyone very much. To be sure of the facts, to avoid any suspicion and unfairness, it was necessary to import one of the young Seirces of Salem. Once Ballard made up his mind to undertake the experiment, he won the support of many of the leading citizens who regarded his plan as a civic project of great virtue. Goody Ballard was by no means the only invalid in town. Any number of people had sicknesses in the family, and when a doctor found a plain physical cause, it was foolhardy to deny that witchcraft might have originated and aggravated it. Ballard's neighbors stood ready to share the expense. Accordingly, man and horse were sent to Salem to fetch back the luckiest accuser that could be spared. It was how the younger Anne Putnam found herself one summer day riding up to Andover for an outing. Puny though she was, the little girl sat well on a horse. For all the Puritans, male or female, were famous riders, and on the rare occasion when Anne was in town, she had always been able to spot the witch reasonable. She did not on this occasion ride alone. Mary Walcott had been persuaded to come with her. It was a quite wonderful experience for the simple village maids who until now had hardly been fathered from home in Salem town. Had hardly been farther from home than Salem town. They were received with utmost respect. Even something like reverence had not always been in Salem. For all their fame, they had always been plagued by the knowledge that there were skeptics about. Though magistrates and judges hung on Anne's every word, her uncle, Joseph Putnam, did not. Even that decent woman, Sarah Ingersoll, had never let her forget that for all her power of divination, she was only a little girl, as subject to discipline as any. But here in Andover, it was different. There were no skeptics, at least they did not meet any, and the difference accorded them could not have been greater had they been princesses. What awaited them was touching. It was not only superstition, but love and need that had summoned the girls. In a score of homes, sick rooms had been readied, and pious care and the visitation was being awaited in the same prayerful faith that the lame, the halt, and the blind had once waited on Christ and his disciples. Such faith should have made them whole, and indeed, in some instances it did, but there was tragedy in Andover in that the healers were not themselves whole, but full of corruption, and that it was the corruption they imparted. The girls led from house to house, focused on their tranced glare on the sick bed, and almost always saw a variant of the same vision, one which at the patient's head and other at his feet. They reported these things very often. Young people who in the house broke into halls, fell into convulsions, and had their own eyes opened to the horror. Anne and Mary could hardly enter a house without giving the gift of second sight to some of those within. They had not gone far, however, before the serious difficulty arose. The girls were in a strange town where they were ill acquainted with names, and knew almost nothing of the gossip, which attaches itself to the witch-like through. Though in this they were probably receiving instruction, they could see a witch spectrally ply her trade, but they could not seldom positively identify her. In justice to all, it was necessary to conduct a scientific experiment. The only thing that comes to mind of that is the fucking Monty Python. She's a witch. She's a witch. Uh, okay. They could in justice to all, it was necessary to conduct a specific experiment. A conclave of public spirited citizens, among them Bernard, most of the deacons of the church, and justice of peace Dudley Bradstreet, son of the vulnerable ex-governor, arranged the details and appointed the meeting house for the purpose. If the senior pastor, Francis Dane, disapproved of the purpose, if the senator, Pastor Francis Dane, disapproved at this stage, he did not succeed in making his disapproval effective against the impressive opposition. In any way, the whole thing was an experiment which might come to nothing. At the meeting, however, he remained observantly in the background, leaving the public prayers to his eager colleague. The experiment took the form of a kind of ghostly police lineup. The gifted girls were brought into the house in the throes of full possession, and one by one, various men and women were led up blindfolded to touch them. Possibly not all of these so led had been originally suspected. In the interests of complete impartiality, some people who have been above suspicion were included with the others, but this impartially produced unforeseen consequences. The test was that of touch. The hands of the suspects were guided to the hands of the girls, and if the latter then drew a sobbing breath and relaxed her struggles, the entire assembly was witness to the fact that yet another witch had made to call off her devils. What was unforeseen and horrible was that the phenomenon occurred nearly as often as the test was made. No one had supposed that more than half a dozen witches would be picked up in Andover. But before the business was done, Justice Broadstreet found that he had made out 40 warrants. Good God. Even that was not the end. Bradstreet quite at that figure, not because Andover had run out of witches, but because he personally had declared himself done with signing any more warrants on such evidence. On no one was the effect of the disaster more electric than the men and women who so unexpectedly found themselves exposed as witches and wizards. They were all exceedingly astonished and amazed and concentrated and affrighted, even out of reason. Testified 6 women in a joint position made much later. It was not uncommon for some of them to agree after so dramatic a demonstration that they must indeed have been practicing witchcraft. The difficulty was to remember how and when. Mary Osgood, whose husband was deacon, searching her conscience, remembered a time 12 years back after the birth of her last child, a time when she had been ill and unhappy. Most likely the devil had got at her then. On further thought, she connected this period somehow with a cat that must have had diabolical powers. Through though at the time she no whit suspected the cat to be the devil. Samuel Wardwell, diligently searching out his memories under the psychoanalytic probing of the magistrates, remembered that he had sometimes said, "The devil take it," when a creature got into his field. Perhaps that had given the devil his opening. Then he recalled that at the time of his unrequited love for the maid baker, he had seen an assemblance of cats. Cross-examination induced him to remember that the prince of the air had been with the cats and had made him promises, had sworn him to the covenant of 60 years, and had baptized him in the Shalshin River. The most remarkable confession, either at this time or at any other, came from William Baker, probable kin of the maid baker, vainly beloved by Wardwell, subtracting from his account the compulsory fantasy without which no confession could pass as bona fide. Bona fide. Okay, one finds a significant element of sincerity that he made wearied of the Puritan endless preoccupation with damnation was indicated by the fact that the devil seduced him by promising an end to resurrection and judgment, to punishment and shame. That he chafed at class restrictions was suggested by the fact that he found appealing the devil's promise that all men under his rule should be equal and live bravely. Baker was plainly a homespun philosopher with advanced ideas. In the cold eyes of the justices, however, his admissions were only proof of the damning heterodoxy and dissatisfaction with God's providence. It was Baker who described the business like go-getting nature to the witches' Sabbaths, and explain why Salem village had been chosen for attack. It was by reason of people being divided and their deafening with ye minister. He also could not give the exact number of witches now operating in Essex County. The dismaying figure far exceeding the present arrest, 307, and this 307 arrests, and this without counting the Connecticut witches who had ridden up during the spring to help start the campaign. If one Andover witch faltered in his confession, a campaign urged him on. The tormentors of Goody Ballard were early identified as Anne Foster, her daughter Mary Lacey, and her granddaughter, who bore her mother's name. The senior, Mary Lacey, sharply reproached her mother for pleading not guilty. "Mother, how do you do? We have left Christ, and the devil have got hold of us. How shall I get rid of this evil one? I desire God to break my rocky heart, and that I may get the victory this time." The younger Mary confessed glibly, "Where is my mother that made me a witch, and that I knew it not, uh, declaimed the girl. It went on with her disordered thoughts. She had not always obeyed her parents and once ran away for 2 days, a flight which in retrospect seemed virtuous. To her, the devil had come in the shape of a horse. She had not been a witch long, not over a week, well, hardly over a year. Accused women who refused to confess were relentlessly pressed to do so by their next of kin. Sometimes it was because their husbands, to quote Thomas Brattle, did break charity with their dear wives, angst to find themselves mated with monsters. Other kinsmen insisted on confession, true or false, as the only hope of escaping the gallows. Good wife Mary Tyler had made the dismal journey to Salem with her brother and schoolmaster John Emerson, riding alongside and demonstrating that that she confessed until she wished herself in a dungeon, then to be treated. Wished herself in a dungeon than to be so treated. Emerson, having made a shadow play of beating the devil away with her from her eyes, finally washed her hands of her. Well, I see you will not confess. I will not leave you, and then you are undone, body and soul together. I will now leave you, and then you are undone, body and soul together. Her brother persisted, saying that in confessing she could not lie. Good brother, do not say so, wailed Mary Tyler, for I shall lie if I confess, and who shall answer to God for my lie? That she might be innocent and was a preposterous notion to her brother. God will not suffer so many good men to be in error about it. He talked of hanging and continued his demands so long and violent that she thought fairly of her life would have gone away from her, and become so terrified in her mind that she answered to length almost anything they propounded her, but had wronged her conscience in doing so. She was guilty of a great sin and belying herself, and desired to mourn for it as long as she lived. Tyler Mary was not the only one who, after confessing in the first panic, repented after sober reflection in prison. Samuel Wardwell exposed there to be reasoning of the tougher mind, including probably John Proctor, renounced all his admissions and acquaintance with the Prince of Air, a baptism in the Shawshan River, and if he had seen a semblance of cats, what of it? Who had not? There were some stout enough to forbear any confession at all. Abigail Faulkner had a father who would not ask his kin to save their necks by inviting fantasies. He was Francis Dane, who was now trying to arouse the town against the insane course of action to which it had committed itself. The most that Francis Dane's daughter would admit was to say that when the accusing girls irritated her, she had struck her hands together, and for all she knew, the devil might take advantage, but it was the devil not I who afflicted them. At its height, the terror in Andover was worse than that in Salem Village. It came on so suddenly and on such a scale as to cause uncontrolled panic. No one was safe. When the dog was discovered to have been bewitched by John Broadstreet of Andover, another son of the ex-governor, Broadstreet, did not stand on ceremony. He moved out to New Hampshire when his brother, the Justice of Peace, refused to sign any more warrants. He too was cried out on. Afflicted Grills pronounced spectral evidence that he and his wife had committed 9 murders. They too went into hiding. Oh my goodness. But the gale that blew so high was more quickly spent its course. An accusing circle which had formed in Andover, sometimes crying out on the dogs in the street, sometimes on the rulers, the elders, finally met their match. They cried out on a gentleman in Boston, possibly, though not probably, the spectral merchant, Robert Robert Clef, and the latter took noble action. He sent a right to arrest these accusers in £1,000 action of defamation, and entrusted local friends to put the accusers under observation. So coldly, legally, an act which no one in Massachusetts had thought to perform before, had a chastising effect. Adolescents, though enough to watch a hanging without a quorum, bleached at the idea of someone's having to pay £1,000. Their voices became discreet and then fell silent altogether. And now that the clamor was subsiding, people began to listen to the voice of reason and to the voice of Francis Dane. It was as if they had been in a dream, only under the spell of a dream could they have believed so much evil of wife or sister. If they were awake now, formerly they slept, they were still faced with the result of their somnambulism. At least 50 decent people, not tramps or scoundrels, now lay in prison awaiting trial before the court that had never acquitted a suspect. What was Andover going to do about it?